sheets, the sheets which have been uploaded. We're going to be using the sheets from last week. So if you take a look at those sheets from last week, at the top it says Parshat Chukat. Okay, so you can know that you have the right sheets. There should be two of those sheets, starting from number 1 through number 12, and then the flip side, that's one set of sheets. The other set of sheets is the appendix for last week that we're going to do this week, which is more of a more general question of Taamei HaMitzvot and application of halacha based on your understanding of Taamei HaMitzvot, of the rationale for mitzvot, which is here, and it says Parshat Balak on top. The way that it printed out was there are 3 sheets, all not single-sided sheets, 3 single-sided sheets. The second sheet, because it doesn't have a heading. The first and the third say the Parshat Balak for this week's year. So you should have 5 sheets altogether. Okay, and with that we begin. Okay, so now so I apologize, of course, for any confusion. So basically, just to bring us up to speed very quickly to, Jack said, so, okay, you're going to, okay, we want to shift gear. So but first gear, just to bring us back to speed from what we spoke about last week, and for those people who were not here last week. So basically, because of the Parshat Chukat, which of course the beginning of the parsha focuses on Tumah v'Tahara and the Para Aduma specifically. So the topic for last week's shir was a practical application of that question today, in terms of really the only practical application for Tumat Meit, for the Tumah that derives from a corpse, is the question for Kohanim. And everyone just about is familiar with the fact that Kohanim are forbidden to become Taamei, or to be exposed to Tumah, might be a better way of phrasing it. Tumat Met specifically, not any other Tumah, all other forms of Tumah, Kohanim are allowed to become exposed to. It's only Tumat Met, which they are forbidden from being exposed to. That Tumah, so generally speaking, people think of it as, okay, Kohanim can't go into cemeteries. That's basically the extent of it. And and as well, most people are familiar with the halacha that Kohanim are allowed to become Taamei Met for their Shiva Krovim, for their 7 direct relatives, if you will, the nuclear family, for parents, for siblings, for children, Rahman al-Islam, for spouses. Those are the 7 krovim, and that is seems to be pretty explicit in the psukim with regard to that exception. However, the question becomes, in terms of Kohanim, and this was a general question for people remaining tahor, when tahara was more of an issue in terms of the Beit HaMikdash, in terms of Trumot, etc. But today, again, specifically for Kohanim who are forbidden to become exposed to Tumah, that you have in different scenarios where people can become exposed to Tumah, specifically with regard to a modern hospital. So the question becomes, can a Kohen enter a hospital? Because if you have a morgue in the hospital, if people who unfortunately pass away in the hospital, so you have Kohanim who are in that hospital at the same time that the dead bodies are there. So does that expose them to Tumah? And if it does, then can Kohanim be there in the first place? Now, it's important to stress many times over that if there is even a slight question of pikuach nefesh, if you're talking about a situation where the Kohen is going in for a procedure which is in some way life-saving, so then there's no question that the Kohen can go in, because after all, like any other Aveira, the pikuach nefesh, with the few exceptions. But basically, pikuach nefesh is doche just about everything. So of course, and safek pikuach nefesh as well. So if you're dealing with a situation where the kohen has some kind of even slight concern that it's a life endangering situation, so then there's no question, right? Kohen goes into the hospital. But if you're dealing with an elective procedure, or you're dealing with a visiting, you're visiting someone who's ill, or if you're just going into the hospital to speak to an administrator in the hospital. Reasons why people will go into the hospital, which has nothing to do with a direct threat to life. So can a kohen go into the hospital today? So that was the question that we spoke about last time. We began to discuss it. To understand this, there are a few things, again, just to recap of what we got into, because the understanding of what Tumah was all about, so that took up a lot of time last week. In terms of the certain issues. So one of the issues is the question of what's called ohel. Ohel meaning, and this again is explicit in the pasuk, I'm not going to read the psukim again, but basically that a kohen is, or anyone for that matter, is exposed to tumat met, specifically tumat met, if they are found in the same room or literally tent with the corpse. So the question is, how do you define the same tent? Is this if we were in right now in this room, and God forbid there was a dead, that would be ohel. That's a pretty straightforward case. But what happens if the body is in here and I'm standing in the lobby outside? Does that concern? Is that considered ohel? What happens? So the answer there is yes. That is also considered ohel. If you're under the same roof and we saw some of the sources for this last time, but I'm not going to, again, we'll just quickly recapping. If there is an opening which is greater than a tefach, I didn't mention this specific shear last time, tefach by tefach, which is approximately 7 by 7 centimeters, okay, roughly speaking, so about 50 square centimeters. If there's an opening that is there, the tumah will be transported, will be conducted, if you will, into the adjoining room, assuming that there's an opening and also that there's a roof over that opening. Okay, so then you're in the same tent. That's number one. Number two is that there is a halacha which is called sof tumah latzet. Sof tumah latzet, the tumah is eventually going to leave, means that if I am even outside of the building, if there is an overhang, and the tumah now is most likely going to exit through that opening. So then I have, because the assumption is that tumat met specifically is not a static situation. It's something which is dynamic. By that I mean that a corpse is going to be buried, which means that if it's found inside a tent, it's going to have to get out of the tent in order to be its proper internment. So therefore, the halacha views the tumah as preceding the mate before it leaves. Okay, before the mate goes out, the tumah is going out. But that means now that so for example, if I mentioned this last week. So if a kohen, I remember growing up walking in Manhattan, and you pass by a Jewish funeral home. So if you're passing by a Jewish funeral home and there is some kind of awning over the sidewalk, so a kohen has to make a detour around that awning. Right? The assumption, of course, is that there are going to be bodies inside the funeral home and they're going to be coming out. Now, this tumat mate you might not have to avoid that if there's a dedicated exit for the body. In other words, if, let's say, that particular funeral home has in the back another exit in which they remove the bodies into the hearse on the way to the cemetery, and they don't take it out onto the main sidewalk, So then Sof Tumah is not going to come out through that door. But of course, if you are a casual pedestrian, you don't know what the procedures of that particular funeral home are. So you'll make the detour. Again, if you're a Kohen and you have your Tuma antenna are up, so you'll make that particular little detour. But that's an important proviso, namely, and we're going to see this in terms of the halacha, that the idea of Sof Tumah Latzeit is that if you have a dedicated exit, so then you don't have to be worried about any of the other exits. One last point, and then we'll come to the first part of this year, just to sum up in terms of how poskim deal with this kind of issue, is the following. When you're talking about a situation where, if let's say now, just to put this into perspective, if there were, God forbid, a mate in the lobby, okay, there's a mate in the lobby, and I'm in this room. So the doors are open, and as I mentioned before, if doors are open and it's the same structure, so then the Tumah moves from one place to another. However, if I were to close the doors, okay, now the doors are closed, and there is a mate outside in the lobby, and this is a separate room. I've in effect sealed the entrances. So, getting back to the Gulf War, you have a cheder atum. Okay, your room is now sealed. Okay, you haven't put up tape and anything like that. Just close the door. That is sufficient to stop the tumah from coming into here. Right. Well, once tumah is cut off from its source, there's no tumah of ohel. It doesn't reside. Tumah has to be connected. The tumat ohel is connected to the mate. If you block it off, right, so then the tumah stops. So if this were an inner room, which it is, so to anything in the outer rooms won't affect this room if the doors are closed. If the doors are open, then it in effect becomes one large room. Okay, that's the idea. So if that's the case, right? So I won't say sof tumah latzeit into the inner room, because the tumah is not going to go inner. You're not going to move the body into an inner room. You're going to take the body out of the building. So this room then becomes a safe room, as it were, for tumah. So if you're, let's say, now in a hospital situation, and the kohen is in a kohen is in one room, and you close the door to that hospital room. So then no tumah can get into that room. That becomes a safe place, as it were. That's a safe space for tumah. The only concern that you might have would be the sof tumah latzeit issue. Even if a door is sealed, when you assume that the tumah is going to go out that door, at that point, tumah, right? In the funeral home situation, even if the doors are closed, there's a problem of the tumah coming out. That's the idea of sof tumah latzeit. But again, it's sof tumah latzeit, not sof tumah likanes. So tumah is not going to come in. So if you're in an inner room, so you don't have the problem. Okay, so that is the structure. Yeah.
Just the point of discussion, we talk about tumah may both do and not do. Just do.
Okay, so we'll get to that right now. Okay. Yes.
I think we talked last time about a definition of tumah, and I think that metaphysical, whatever, is that the correct description?
Okay, so we're going to touch upon that. That was your question last week in terms of trying to understand it. Right now, I'm looking at tumah the same way I'm looking at tarfut, trefut. I'm looking at it as the same way I would look at chazer. In other words, there is a prohibition to eat certain foods. Right? Why those foods are usher might be for whatever the reason, but from the legal perspective, the normative perspective, it doesn't matter. In other words, I'm just looking at it in terms of the halakha. Same thing in terms of right now, in terms of the tumah. Why should a mate be mitamei? Right? So hopefully we'll get to that in the second part of the year. But it does in terms of the Tuma side of things, it doesn't matter because we're going to treat it on a legal technical basis. So the legal technical basis is that there is this notion of Tuma, the same way that there is a notion of something being non-kosher. And that Tuma exists under certain legal conditions, the same way that, let's say, if I mix meat and milk, so under certain circumstances, it'll be considered basar b'chalav. And under other circumstances, if there is a too small a ratio, less than shishim, less than 1/60th, I don't consider that it's basar b'chalav, right? So even though I put in the chalav and I know that it's there, but if it's only 1% and not 1.666%, so then it's not basar b'chalav, right? So the same token, it's not tumat met if I close the doors, because the tuma just doesn't come in. Is there a way to turn on the air conditioner? Am I the only one who's warm? Okay. If anyone knows a way to turn on the air conditioner, I guess that's the advantage of the Zoom, is that you control your temperature. Right?
People fight about it.
Okay. So, so getting back to now the question, and we'll now go to the question Jacques said in terms of the non-Jew. So, can a Kohen be in a hospital? So, if you take a look here at the on the sheet, number 8 on the sheet from last week, is a tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Specifically, it's dated in 1964, September Yudalet Elul, 1964, and it's with regard to a hospital. And I think that he mentioned specifically in the tshuva Bellevue. Okay, so it's Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan. For those of you who are familiar with it, on the east side. So and the question is, can a Kohen go into the hospital? It's a short tshuva. I made it shorter here. So here he says the following: Hinei ha'evarim hanimtzaim bebatei hacholim yesh lemezal batar ruba deruba shehem shel nochrim. And so, but just one preference. I should have mentioned this. I mentioned this last week as well. There's an earlier tshuva, much earlier tshuva, and this is a tshuva from the mid-19th century in Hungary, the Chuat Shai, and he is speaking about the first tshuva that I'm familiar with that is dealing with what we might call a modern hospital. I don't know if you can call mid-19th century hospitals modern, but we'll call them modern hospitals. So is that you have this kind of function, and he says that we assume that there's what's known as cheskat chayim, that when I go into a hospital, so I'm alive, and hopefully I'm going to stay alive. And we don't assume that people die necessarily at any given moment. If I know that there's someone who is dead in the hospital, so that's something else. But if I am just asking right now at this moment, is there a dead person in this hospital? So the answer, according to the Chuat Shai, is that no, because of that's what's called cheskat chayim, right? Because all of us will eventually die. But at any given moment, if I ask about someone, I don't know where they are, when they, I've seen them, I saw them last week. Should I assume that they're alive right now? The answer is halachically, legally, the answer is yes. I assume that they are alive unless proven otherwise. So the same thing holds true, he says, with regard to the hospital. So therefore, Cohen can go in. That's basically it's more developed than that, but that's the gist of it. That changes, of course, in a modern hospital. That might have been true in the 19th century, and maybe in their hospitals, whenever someone would pass away in the hospital, they would be removed to a different building. But basically, in modern hospitals, so you have there at any given moment, with 100% surety that there is a dead body in the hospital. If you have a hospital the size of Bellevue, right, which is which dwarfs, I don't know, but it's certainly larger than, let's say, Hadassah, much larger. So then if you have that kind of hospital, so you have the morgue, you have the laboratories with all sorts of tissue and various libs, etc. If it's a teaching hospital, so then you have anatomy classrooms and the like. So then the saying that there's a cheskat chayim doesn't apply anymore, because you know for a fact that there are dead bodies here in the hospital. So that's the situation that Rav Moshe is referring to. So he says, okay, now I'm dealing with that kind of hospital, but presumably, even in New York City in the 1960s, that the overwhelming majority of the patients in the hospital are non-Jews. What? Right. Okay. No. He's saying the mezal means to go in Aramaic. Okay. So the now this is based on the number 7. Number 7, the Shulchan Aruch deals with this question, which is much earlier than Shulchan Aruch, but here in terms of this, that when it comes to non-Jewish dead, so the concept of ohel, specifically ohel, touching a non-Jewish body, according to the overwhelming majority, there's a one or two, I guess you could say, outliers in terms of saying that if you touch a non-Jewish body, so then you don't become Taamei. But the overwhelming majority, 99.999% of poskim throughout the generations, would tell you that if you touch a non-Jewish body, that is tumat met. However, the din specifically of being exposed when you are in the same room, the same ohel, that already is a machloket, a significant machloket, where the majority of Rishonim, without getting into why right now, majority of Rishonim tend to say that a non-Jewish body is not going to have the tumah in an ohel. It is a mate, it's tumat mate, but the specific din of tumat ohel doesn't apply to a non-Jew. This is brought in here in number 7 in the Shulchan Aruch, and he says the following: Kivrei ovdei kochavim, nachon lizaher kohen milalech alehem. So when it comes to a non-Jewish grave, if I enter a non-Jewish cemetery, so then it is appropriate for a kohen to be wary of it. Okay, very non-committal type of language. The idea being that what the Shulchan Aruch is basically saying, and the Rambam says this explicitly, that the dead of non-Jewish dead are not mitamei ohel. However, there is a minority opinion that says that they are. So therefore, Kohen should be aware of this and try to avoid becoming Taamei to non-Jewish dead as well. Okay, that's the idea. And the Ramah says, or as he said, you should be careful about it. The Ramah says, there are those who are mekel. You still should be nachon lahachmir. You should be machmir. This is perhaps the question is of being careful. What does it mean being careful? So being careful means presumably that if it's for a need which is I guess you could say is optional. As if, let's say, and here too, there are those who are making on this as well for Kohanim. Can a Kohen go into a museum? And in this museum, there are bodies that are in the exhibits, right? Or skeletons or whatever it may be. Can a Kohen go into that kind of museum? So there are those who are following this argument, the Shulchan Aruch, is to say you should be machmir. In other words, it's an educational use. It's certainly not frivolous. Okay, might depend on the museum, but it's basically not frivolous. But is it absolutely necessary? Is it something which is very important? How do you judge that? So many poskim will tell you under those circumstances that Kohen doesn't have to. Kohen should avoid going into museums where you know that there are bodies that are being exhibited. Yeah.
The last case, which doesn't have a opening.
Okay, so then you're absolutely correct. You have to now get into, does Tov Tuma Latzet, will that apply under these circumstances when it's a permanent exhibit? Will I view the glass case as having the halacha of a kever, which might have its own specific halachot? How much space is there between the body and the glass, right? So that is the glass acting as a barrier or not? Or is the glass considered a continuation of the body? Right? All of these questions are detailed halachic questions which have to be dealt with. I'll just, when I was in Chicago, just to give an example, as the Rosh Kollel says, I mentioned last week, so I'm a Kohen. For fundraisers, the Kollel would have their dinners at different museums in Chicago. Right? That was a way to bring in the crowd to be able to come to these museums. And in different museums, so in the aquarium, it wasn't a problem. In the Museum of Science and Technology, so it was a problem. And before the dinner, right, at the time of Gedalia Dov Schwartz Zatzal was the Av Beitin. So the accepted psak in Chicago was that Kohanim should not go into museums, and they had a list of which museums they could go into, which museums they could not go into. So in order to facilitate the dinner, the Beit Din of the CRC, the Chicago Rabbinical Council, was in contact with the director of that museum to arrange for the proper blocking off of those wings so that we could have the dinner in the facility. But there are detailed halachic questions which I don't want to get into now. But you have to ask those questions. You have to be aware of them. Yeah.
I can only imagine going trying to figure out what kind of craziness is going on.
You know what? There is, the carpenter put in my kitchen a few years back, a very nice Christian Arab fellow, and he said, this was, he goes, in terms of the scheduling, so we couldn't make it before Pesach, whatever it was. So he just said, the Muslims, he was making fun of Ramadan and things like that. They're crazy. We're crazy. He's he's a Greek Orthodox, with Lent and all of that. But none of us come close to you guys before Pesach. I mean, that was his, so yeah, they're laughing at us anyway. Trust me, this is like, okay, fine. A little too much, mate. Okay, yeah.
The Nusach says kivrei of day kochavim.
Right.
It doesn't say not food.
Right.
So does it apply only to people?
No. So that's a good way to keep the censors happy. In other words, whenever you see generally Ovdei Kochavim in these texts, as opposed to Nachrim, there are times when it's specific to Ovdei Kochavim, but many times in the Gemara, because of the censors, the word Nachri was replaced with Ovdei Kochavim. So that way, we're not in any way have a different halacha for goyim. We have different halacha for pagans and idolaters. Yeah.
Also, it says Kohanim, that it doesn't apply to Israelim.
Right.
And the Ramah, when he says that the Nachon Lachmir, it's about Kohanim.
Correct. Only Kohanim. Right. As I told you, all the Israelim here, you can do all of this with impunity, and and you can wave to me as you go in. Yeah.
But even the Kohanim with Chizkah.
So we'll get to that in a second. So now, because we mentioned last week, we'll get back to it just very, very quickly. So Rav Moshe in the Tshuva says the following: Lachen Medina, Yesh leMeizal Batar Ruba. This is in the print. Yesh leMeizal Batar Ruba Shehem Shel Nachrim. So now, in terms of the halacha, you can rely on the fact that the majority of the patients, the majority of the dead, are non-Jews. What? Okay. Shenivsat me'ikar adin she'em mitamin ba'ohel v'lachen litzorech gadol. Emphasize the word tzorech gadol. Yesh la baker cholo chulek robo gomi ta'aro ha'gadol ch'alehu aviv o umishom shalom ha'mishpacha she'em krovei ishta. It's very interesting the way that he says that. In other words, basically, Rav Moshe is looking at this and he's saying, look, you can assume that the most of the people are non-Jews. But the moment that you say most of the people are non-Jews, then we can go back to what I mentioned before in the Tshurat Shai, that earlier tshuva, that I don't have to assume that there is a Jewish dead person here. In other words, in the morgue at any given moment, there are dead people. But right now, do I have to assume there are Jewish dead people in the morgue? The answer Rav Moshe says is no, because when we follow the rule of Rov, the majority, so then it's as though the minority doesn't exist. Whereas if I say because of the halachot of Rov that I have meat, I have some kind of mixture of meat, and I know there's kosher meat and non-kosher meat, and I say because of Rov that you're allowed to eat the meat, so then you don't have to say, well, maybe this piece is kosher. There, at a certain point, when you know for a fact that there is one non-kosher piece, so, and this is in itself, there are even some opinions that say that you can eat all of the meat, because at any given moment, you can say, oh, I'm probably eating kosher, and oh, maybe I know there's a non-kosher piece, I probably ate it already, and I can eat it, right? So then, okay, but the halacha is that one piece. Right, one piece, even though you don't know whether it's kosher or not. But here you don't have to worry about that in this particular case. When it comes to majorities, we follow the majority. So we assume if you know for a fact that there is a Jewish person, and I think in this quote I also said that he says that if the last bold line, Yivarer Masha Efsharlo Im Yeshem Atamet Yisrael. Ideally, you should pick up the phone and ask the morgue, do you have any Jewish dead? Right? Since that's basically not going to happen in a hospital, you can't do that. So then you can rely on the Rov. Right? Exactly. Anyway, you ask the for the names. Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
One time when I was in Paris, I visited the Holocaust Museum there.
Yeah.
And the very last exhibit was some kind of cube which had the names of Holocaust victims.
So that would be very problematic for a Cohen. Absolutely. I mean, you could argue that it's very problematic just from a kvod beit situation, right? But there are these questions where you have. I remember there are museums. I don't remember which museum where I saw it exhibited, but I was told that they had taken care of the Tuma issue there. I'm trying to remember where it was. Maybe it was the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles, where there was a lampshade made of human skin from the Shoah, and that would be a problem. Absolutely. In any event, so you could see from Rav Moshe though that he's basically saying if you're in Israel and you don't have, right, you're not in Bellevue, right, you're now in Hadassah and Karen. So Rav Moshe doesn't address the question. He was asked in 1964, but one feature of Rav Moshe's tshuva, just to mention, as opposed to other poskim, some poskim, when they're given a shaila, they use it as their opportunity to discuss the issue and give you a much broader picture. Rav Moshe, for the most part, I won't say with 100%, Rav Moshe did not do that. Rav Moshe was asked a question, he answered the question. He was asked about Bellevue, he gave an answer about Bellevue. He didn't use the opportunity to say, okay, now I'm going to write a treatise on Kohanim and going into hospitals. Right? He just talked about just the specific question. So I can't know for sure what he would say about a Jewish hospital, or a hospital with a large or a high percentage of Jewish patients. What?
He didn't answer the question about, let's say, Mount Sinai.
Right. Correct.
Or any Jewish hospital.
Correct.
certainly 30, 40, 50 years ago, where the majority.
Majority of patients, right? So if it's so he didn't answer that question.
No, but it's
So what
different.
so you could perhaps deduce from this tshuva that he would be machmir in that case, right? Because even here, when it comes to the non-Jewish, they say specifically if it's a bikur cholim situation, and it's not just any bikur cholim, it's not just going over to a neighbor. It's a specific case where the person would be, there would be an issue if you didn't come, right? So he's saying if it's a parent, a child, or, and it's interesting how he phrases it, mishum shalom, krovei ishto, right? So going to visiting your in-laws, right? They might not be pained if they don't see you. In fact, they might be pained if they do see you, but it's not going to be a good situation in the family if you don't go and visit your sister-in-law or whoever it is. So therefore, so that he uses as an exception case. Okay, so it's basically saying that when I have these, if you will, these halachic tools to be lenient, at the same time, I should only be using the tools if there is a significant need. Okay, now this becomes it comes a question of the hospitals here. So as I mentioned last week, there has been a significant movement. It started with, I believe, Shaarei Tzedek, Laniado in Netanya, which was Tzanz, where the hospitals that were run under Orthodox auspices, so we're already from the get-go very sensitive about these things. So and there are technical solutions for these problems. So, for example, just in terms of the morgue. So, if you create a double door system, so at no point is the tuma getting into the rest of the hospital. If you have a dedicated exit at the back of the morgue to take the bodies out, so you don't have to worry about sof tuma, let's say, into the rest of the hospital. So so there are technical solutions. If you deal without getting into the details, you can create breaks in terms of the ohel to separate different wards. If you've ever noticed, I don't know if you have, I pay attention to these things because of by dint of my status. But there are, let's say, in the Beit Hespedim on Har Menuchot. So there is a shelter for Kohanim on the left side when you're there, and there is a break in there's a break from the door of the Beit Hespedim to the shelter. Like if you look up, there is a gap in the air, right? That the shelter doesn't touch the wall of the Beit Hespedim, and that's intentional. So that way, any tumah that comes out, if there would be sof tumah, let's say, will not continue on into the shelter because the ohel has been broken, and you can do this in different ways in the hospital itself. So and as I mentioned to you just this past month, so Kupat Cholim Klalit came out with a news release how the hospital up in Afula Ha'emek has now been made Kohen friendly, and there's a map that you can get to know which wards you can go in. So there are technical solutions, and here in Eretz Yisrael, I think that most of the hospitals are moving. It's becoming more Kohen friendly as we go along, as more people are sensitive to these issues. So the hospitals are responding in kind. However, there are still plenty of hospitals where it's not functional. Yeah, sorry.
What about double doors?
Yeah.
It's a good effect.
So the double door stops. It's what I said before. In other words, basically, if this door is closed, the tumah can't go out. I open up the door, the tumah goes out. But if this door can only open when another door on the other side is closed, so then if I'm on the other side of that door, I'm never going to have a problem. So if I have let's say if this is the morgue and there's the hallway, I can't go into the hallway, but outside of the hallway, the tumah will never go out because either the inner door is closed, or the outer door is closed. So all these different systems, perhaps a revolving door can work.
It's sort of like the mission overseas 4 years ago, developing double doors against terrorists. We got double doors against them.
Right. Okay. Basically the same type of thing. In other words, we're just ahead of the game. All right, we're dealing with their tumor before they're dealing with their terrorists.
Terrorists are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just a quick question. The guy after the car accident, the guy is killed, can the Cohen touch that body?
No.
That's
Right. That would be the answer. The short answer would be no. Right. Okay. Now let's keep moving because we're getting caught up in the details. So now, what about Jewish hospitals where you don't have the technical solutions? Or you don't know if there are technical solutions? Can a Kohen go in? So this is just a very interesting way where you see how poskim deal with different things. And I'm just going to read the following. I'm just going to add one more halachic hurdle to the mix before we read the tshuva of Shlomo Zalman, and then we're going to leave it because there's plenty more that I can speak about, but it'll just keep us going a little bit too long, and I want to get to the second part of the shir. There is a notion when it comes specifically to tuma, the following idea. It says safek tuma birshut harabim. If you have a safek, whether there's a tuma in a public domain, and here public domain means where there are many people that are moving. So if you have a safek tuma, so the halacha is tahor. Okay, don't ask me why. That's the halacha. It's well grounded. There's a question here whether that means that a Kohen can enter into an area where there's safek tuma. It's basically the following: is if the Kohen went in or anyone else went in during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, you went in and someone said, "Oh, there's a grave here somewhere. We don't know where." Right? There are two paths. Classic case of the Gemara. There are two paths. One has the grave. One doesn't have the grave. We don't know which one is which. And you went down one of the paths. So now, can you walk into the Beit HaMikdash without going through the Paradum and all of that? The answer is yes. Safek Tumah B'Reshut HaRabim Tahor. But the question is, does that mean a Kohen knowingly, lichatchila, can do it? Right? In terms of the Isser aspect of a Kohen, is it identical to the Tumah aspect? That's a question. Machloka. Leave it as you can all understand why, on the one hand, you say, well, is he going to become Taamei? The answer is no, so then it's mutter. Or you could say, that's not the question only. Here is, can he become exposed to Tumah? And theoretically, he could become exposed to Tumah, so he shouldn't. The two sides to it. Those say yes, and some those say no. Just throwing it out is another aspect to be dealt with. Now, just in terms of the tshuva, okay, and this is, as I said, I want to put this aspect, this halacha to bed. It's, as you can see, just simply a simple question of can a Kohen walk into a hospital is just opens up a Pandora's box of halachic questions of how to deal with it, and that's really what I wanted you to see that it does, and then to see how posts can deal with it. And so here is the tshuva of Rav Shlomo Zalman. It's number 15. Okay, number 15. With regard to a knisa kohen lebeit cholim. So he says the following: Nireh de'en lismoch al had safek tuma b'reshut harabim shesveiko tahor. Because you could say, I don't know if there's a tuma right now, and a hospital certainly a reshut harabim. Right? There are thousands of people in this hospital, tens of thousands perhaps, depending on the size of the hospital. So it's certainly a reshut harabim. So it's safek tuma, and I don't have to worry about it. So Rav Shlomo Zalman says you shouldn't rely on that. And he explains shaharei katav hamarcheshet, because he quotes those opinions who feel that it's the second side of what I said a moment ago, that it doesn't apply to a Kohen. The Kohen hamitamei atzmo b'safek tuma b'rshut harabim, av she'eno over alav shelo yitama, mikol makom over alav delo lavo misafek. Right? When it comes to the Kohen, the way the Torah says it do not become tamei, and also says lo tavo, do not come into contact with tuma. So this is coming into contact with tuma. Even though it's tahor, mikom makom harei nichnas misafek ba'ol admit. So he says you shouldn't. Okay, so number one, he gets rid of that. Gam no sedidan, so it's still usher. The im yesh meit bebeit hacholim. So it said, if there is a dead person in the hospital, this isn't the case where, well, maybe there's a dead body buried under the hospital somewhere. This is, there's a hospital with a clear administrative structure, and someone can touch a computer key and tell you exactly where the body is right now. And there are not only that one person, there's presumably tens of people who can do that in the various hospital offices. So to call that a safek, he says, is problematic. Uminayin shemutar lechatchila af b'chi hagavna she'efshar levakesh me'acharim levaker b'makom ulevarer im yesh hamet. So why can't you ask other people to go visit and check it out for you before you walk into the hospital? And it could be what happens if, when you're in the hospital, someone dies. So then you're going to have a problem. The halacha is for a Kohen, if there is a person who is on their deathbed, Rahman al-Itzlan, so a Kohen is not supposed to go into visit at that point, because that person very well might pass away while the Kohen is there. Gam bezeh. So similarly here, statistically, there's a good chance that you will come into contact with a dead person. Vitu, the Kamosha Katvu, so we'll just skip to the next bold print. If you're dealing with a large hospital, if you're dealing with a small, rural hospital, maybe it would be different. But if you're dealing with a large urban hospital, you should have to assume that there is tumah there. And going through all of the different situations. Then he basically says it's usher for a Kohen to go in. Okay, that would be the bottom line. But then that's not the bottom line. He says the following. So he now mentions that earlier tshuva that I said before, that you have to assume people are basically alive. V'gam, the last two lines of the tshuva. Gam yesh lismo al hasovrim desof tuma latzeit hu rak midrabanan. You can rely on those opinions who said that this halakha that I said before of the tuma going out is perhaps only rabbinic. That's a machloket. V'gam yesh sovrim shetuma overt mecheder lecheder hi rak midrabanan. There are those opinions, it's a minority opinion, but it's an important minority opinion that says that what I said before, that if there's a bait in this room and I'm outside in a different room, but open with an opening to that other room, and I said that's considered one ohel. There's a significant minority opinion that says that is rabbinic in nature. It's not really one ohel. It's really not ohel on the doraita level, but the Chachamim said it's the same building. So we're going to make that usher, since this is only drabanan. Lachen imi efshar lo levarer mutar lo likanes bishum mitzvat bikur cholim. So it's basically what you see here, and you see it also, I think, with Rav Moshe's tshuva. That's why I was hesitant to say what would Rav Moshe say in a Jewish hospital. There is a significant, poskim are very much aware of the of human needs. And when poskim are looking at the situation, they're not looking at it simply as saying, okay, this is the halacha, and now can I find a kula? But rather, they're saying human needs are an intricate part of the halachic process. And the chachamim, if these are didim derabanan, for example, so on the one hand you say, yes, this is significant. Why did the chachamim say that that tuma should be able to transport itself, as it were, from one room to another? Because most people, just from the little that we've been speaking about, you can see the intricacies of the halakha and how complicated it is. And it's much easier to paint things in a black and white type of way. If you're a Kohen, don't go into a building with a dead body, period. Rather than saying, if you're in the room on the side and the door is closed, you're okay. Right? But don't be in an outer room with the door closed because maybe the tumor is going to go through. Right? All of these details are well and good for, if you will, the halachic expert, but for most people, and then frequently when you're talking about a situation, there's a classic case. I'm not going to read it inside, but it becomes the classic case. Do you have to wake up a Kohen? Right? Kohen is sleeping and a person dies. Do you have to wake him up? Tell him to leave. The Kohen is, as the general custom of people a few centuries ago was to sleep naked. The Kohen is naked, and you basically tell him you're Taamei, so you have to go out. There's an Isser. He's going to run out in the street, buck naked, right? Do you have to do this? Or does his basic human dignity also factor in, right? These are situations that the poskim are aware of, and they understand them. It's not that it's a kula. We're shopping for a kula, as it were, to use that terminology. But the realia, the way that people are living and their needs are an intrinsic part of the process, and that's what's happening here. Whereas he goes through this tshuva explaining why you shouldn't be makel and you should be checking things out. But then he says, bottom line is, if you can't and you don't, there are so many different parts here that are rabbinic, or perhaps rabbinic. And if that's the case, visiting people who are ill is also very important. That's also a mitzvah. Not only in the situation, I'm not going to read the next tshuva, the Shevet Halevi. He says that the mitzvah Bikur Cholim as a mitzvah that's important enough is only if it's going to significantly affect the person's mental health. Right? It's a person that you're very close with. And he talks about, going to visit a person, a newborn, going into the maternity ward. Right, so maternity ward, and it's a big party around the whole family's there, and the tribe is there, seeing the newest member, right? That's not really Bikur Cholim. He says that's his position. I'm not saying we accept it. So that isn't the need. Each posek is going to view it a little differently. What's considered significant and what's not considered to be significant. What's the mitzvah? But the point is, they all are dealing with a fabric of different aspects of dealing with these type of conditions. So Rav Moshe's tshuva, he had it easy, right? Because he could just say, okay, I have even a majority shita that says that the bodies of non-Jews are not mitamei met, and therefore I can rely on that and simply put the question to bed. And even then he says it's only when there's significant need. But if you were dealing with a Jewish hospital, maybe he'd be machmir, but I'm not going to say that he would be machmir, because he might look at the significant human need and say, okay, then I'll also be relying on other positions to allow for a Kohen to enter. So here, just yesterday, I looked at I wasn't aware of it. I just looked at a piece by Rav Asher Weiss, Shlita Minchas Asher, where he talks about it. He gives basically the same kind of breakdown that I've given here, and he says, in my opinion, Kohanim can go into hospitals to visit people along the lines of what we just said in terms of Rav Moshe, in terms of Rav Shlomo Zalman. Yeah.
And I was just going to point out that Shlomo Zalman sort of gives a blanket, unlike Rav Moshe. He doesn't say that there's only if it's a great need. It's sort of a blanket. It's a mitzvah.
Right. Correct. Right. But again, what is the mitzvah Bikur Cholim? Is mitzvah Bikur Cholim visiting
for
anyone? Someone who just broke their leg and is in for 2 days? Or is Bikur Cholim, again, he doesn't say. He just says Bikur Cholim. You're right. It's
doesn't seem to differentiate.
Right. He doesn't seem to differentiate. So each posek is dealing with it, and they deal with it in slightly different ways. But I think that they all have this in common, and this is what's very important to stress. And I think that frequently people do not look at it that way. They look at it in terms of, what's the halacha, and then are you going to be mekel or you're not going to be mekel? Well, it's the same, because of pressing need, will you be mekel? So here, I don't think it's because it's, and I don't think in most, if maybe not in any of the questions, is it a separate piece. It's rather, it is part of the whoop and the wharf of the halachic process, is the conditions of why you are doing what you want to do or need to do. And so in this circumstances, it could very well be that at the same posik that will tell a Kohen that he can go to a hospital, knowing full well that there's going to be a morgue and all of that, might tell that same Kohen that you can't go into a museum, even though you know that the body that you're going to be going to is a non-Jewish body. Right? Because the need, if you will, to go into a museum is not the same as the one of Bikur Cholim. Okay, with that in mind, I just want to now get into this week's show. And that is, as I said, a spin-off of what was asked last week with regard to Taamei HaMitzvot. So in the discussion last week, it was part of the expected path, was that the question of what is Tumah. And I mentioned, this is the source here, source number one, that without getting into the background, it's a fascinating story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and a Roman who has a discussion with him. This is the appendix sheet, that it says that the Roman basically says Tuma and Tumat Mate. Well, that's a bunch of hocus pocus voodoo, isn't it? And so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's response to him was, well, when a person has a spirit, an evil spirit takes over him. So how do you get rid of it? And so the pagan gave whatever formula for removing a poltergeist was. And so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, well, that's how we view this in a similar way. And this is how we get rid of it. The pagan was very happy and walked out of the Beit Midrash. And then the Talmidim said, okay, right? He has a Goyish cup. We know that you were able to push him with a reed. Okay, you gave him, you knew who your audience was, you gave an answer. It was apologetic, it worked great. But now what's the truth? And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, here it's in the bold in source number one. So he said, what are you going to tell us? Amar lahem chayechem. Right? So he said, by your lives. Lo hamet mitameh, the lo hamayim mitaharin. There is no such thing as tuma, and there is no such thing as the water purifying. This is it's not that there is some spirit of tuma, but rather it is a gezerah of God. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu chukah chakakti lachem gezerah gazarti ein ata rishai la'avo al gezerati. I made the gezerah, you follow. Dichtiv zod chukat Torah. That's what the pasuk means of chukat Torah. So this is a very strong formulation that basically to look at mitzvot and basically say, what's the purpose of mitzvot? Especially those mitzvot that we don't understand the rationale for, but not necessarily only. And that is that God wants discipline. So it doesn't matter if it was mate, which is tamei, or peanut butter, which is tamei. If God tells us that you should stay away from it, you stay away from it. Why? Because God told you. That's it. You don't ask questions. If God says no, it's no. That's it. Right? This is the opinion. What's interesting is that in that very same midrash, the midrash quotes the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right? The great leader of Am Yisrael at the time of the Churban of the second Beit HaMikdash. But this is a much later midrash that's quoting the story, and then it puts in the following line. Take a look at the next line. So the midrash asks, why is the para aduma, the heifer, why is that a female animal? Why is it a cow, as opposed to the overwhelming majority of korbanot, which are bulls and not cows. So why is this one a cow? So Amar Rabbi Evu. So Rabbi Evu said, he's a much later source, is an Amora. Amar leben mashal leben shivcha shetinef palterin shamel. So it is comparable to the son of a maid who has soiled the palace of a king. Okay, no, there was an infant, a toddler, right, and the diaper leaked all over the throne room floor. Okay, Amar Hamelech. So the king says, Tavo imo v'tekaneach et hatzoah. Let the mother come and clean up, right, this child's excrement. Kach amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So too God said, Tavo para, let a cow come, u'techaper al ma'aseh ha'egel, and be an atonement for the calf, for the golden calf. Okay? Now, the fact that the Midrash says, let's juxtapose this line with the previous story. And as I said, the stories themselves, the opinions are separate, is a very powerful statement, in my opinion. Basically, what it's saying is that, we can accept Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai's approach. There's a chukah chakakti, that's it. God says, jump, you ask how high, and that's it. Right? But nevertheless, we are supposed to be looking at that very chukah, right? This is the paradigm of a chukah paraduma, and still look for significance that we can accept and we can understand and say, oh yes, this is God's gzeirah, but there is a connection to the egel. And there is that element that's involved as well. The two are living side by side, that you're looking at this and you have this sense of commitment, total commitment, without asking questions, military discipline, as it were, but at the same time, you are seeking meaning, and that the two can live simultaneously in the same thought. We don't have time to really get into this. Actually, a few years ago, I gave a full shir on the question of Taamei HaMitzvot. I'll just point out here that there are some of the more important or the more well-known opinions. The idea here, just to it's number 3. The 3 got cut off here. Rav Sadia Gaon, right? So he says the following with regard to it. He makes a distinction between 2 categories of mitzvot. Much longer piece, but this is and as well as much more involved idea. But he distinguishes between what he calls mitzvot sichliot, meaning mitzvot of reason, and mitzvot shmayot, right? Mitzvot that you hear, meaning mitzvot that were given to us by revelation, and that the mitzvot sichliot are mitzvot that we could have worked out ourselves. Might still need the revelation to work out the exact parameters. For example, just the easiest example, murder. Okay, so that's pretty hopefully intuitive that's bad. Okay, but what's murder? What is there? Warfare. So warfare could always be considered to be murder. Under what circumstances is it permissible? Under what circumstances is it forbidden? What are the rules there are? Abortion. How do I define a human life? Is it from the moment of conception? Is it from the moment of birth? Is it from the moment when the child is able, in the Roman world? So there was a common practice of infanticide, right? Because abortion was too dangerous to the mother, so they would perform the abortion, as it were, as soon as the baby was born. At what point do you consider this to be a human life where it becomes lo tirtzah? So for that, you might need the revelation to define it. That's something already that thinking people can legitimately disagree about. Right? And we see it to this day in terms of the debate about abortion. Right? Exactly what is the defining moment of life, and at what point that is it considered to be a crime to put an end to that life? So you need both, even with the shichliyot. But then there's the concept of the shmuyot, which basically is revelation, things that you wouldn't know otherwise. And even on the shmuyot, there is a, if you will, there is a range and a spectrum, because you can say, for example, Shabbat. You never would have come up with Shabbat by yourself necessarily. But once you have Shabbat, we can all hopefully appreciate the deeper meaning and the deeper value of Shabbat. You might not say, you could say that, you might not say that about eating basar b'chalav. Right? So then you might say, even after it's been revealed to me, I'm still not able to necessarily, or para aduma, I'm still not going to be able to necessarily appreciate the deeper meaning, if there is a deeper meaning. And maybe certain things we're going to end up with saying, lo ha-beit mitamei, de lo ha-hamayim mitaharin, that there are certain things that are indeed arbitrary. And as all of these different aspects can live in harmony in one system. The Rambam, I'm not going to read it inside because I want to get to one halachic question, right, to show how it has a halachic impact as well. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, as elsewhere as well, but basically distinguishes between the big questions and the little details. We can say, the Rambam says, you can talk about why did the Torah say that you have to shecht an animal as opposed to eating a carcass. So the answer is because you have to be humane in the way that you kill the animal. But the Rambam says you can never come up with an explanation why you have to shecht it this way instead of putting the head on the chopping block and with a very sharp axe, chopping off the head from behind, instantaneously severing the head. Right? Just as humane, right? But it is that one animal is treif, it's a nevela, and the other animal is kosher. Why? The Rambam says you're never going to come up with an explanation for the small details. The big questions you can come up with, the small details the Rambam feels is impossible. There are others who go beyond it. Shimshon Farel Hirsch took an issue with the Rambam. And Shimshon Farel Hirsch said, no, you can, or we are obligated to try to find the meaning even in the smaller details. Okay? So there is this broad range. What I want to just finish with is the following tshuva. It's at the it's source number here. It's source number 7. No, I'm not going to get to number 7. That's going to take me too long. Number 5. It's a tshuva of the Chassam Sofer. In the tape, I was listening to the tape of the shir that I gave on this topic, and I didn't get to the source number 7 last time either. Eventually, I'll get to source number 7. Anyway, source number 5. Basically is the following: shiluach haken. Okay, shooing away the mother bird, and so you can look at this as perhaps the paradigm for a mitzvah where we can all appreciate the rationale behind it. Okay, put it in a little asterisk. Won't get into the asterisk right now in terms of maybe not, but we'll assume for the moment that it is. The question is, and this becomes an issue starting in this, at least in documented history, maybe even earlier, but in the 17th century, and to this day, there are people who do this. The question arises the following: do I have to seek out this mitzvah? Right? Do I have the mitzvah? Okay, there's for whatever the reason, there's a pigeon nest, and I want to take the eggs and I want to make a pigeon omelet. Okay, fine. So I have to shoo away the mother bird. It's cruel if I don't, etc. Or the way the Ramban understands it, not that the act itself from the pigeon perspective, from the bird brain perspective, we're just another predator, right? Does the pigeon care if it's us or a hawk? No, it doesn't really matter to the pigeon. But from my perspective, I have to work on myself not to be a cruel person. So the fact that I shoo away the mother, that is sharpening my moral sensitivity and my moral and my just emotional sensitivity. That's the way the Ramban understands it. Be that as it may, I don't like pigeon omelets. I've never had a pigeon omelet to know whether I like it or not, and I'm really not too intent on finding out. But there's this great mitzvah, it's called Shiluach HaKen. So now do I have to go traipsing around looking for pigeon nests, right? To shoo away the mother bird, to take the eggs, right? And then to throw them out. Okay? So it's already a question. The Chassam Sofer is in the middle of the, which is number 5 here, is the middle of the road. The truth was already asked a couple of centuries before him. So the Chassam Sofer, the Chazon Ish also, they say, the whole purpose is to become more sensitive. So now you're going to wantonly look for ways to be insensitive so you can be Mekayim the mitzvah, right? It is, so now if you're looking at the mitzvot simply as, okay, Gzeira Gazarti, Chukach Chakakti, I gave you the Gzeira, this is it, right? So why should I be concerned? So you want to say that's the rationale for the mitzvah? Maybe that's the rationale, or maybe that's not the rationale. I don't care. God just told me, shoo away mother birds. That's why I should be doing it. So I should be seeking out every mother bird that I can to be Mekayim the mitzvah. And I can make a shooing away party, right? Simchat mitzvah. Right? But here, under these circumstances, the poskim are saying I should be taking a look at what the rationale for the mitzvah is. And the rationale for the mitzvah it's not just a philosophical question per se. It is something which can impact on what the halacha is directly. Now, having said that, I just want to be, if you will, melamed zchut for those people who do it, even though I certainly emotionally disagree and go with what the Chassam Sofer says here, and as well as others, is that what's the reason for it? So there are those who say, well, what we all sort of instinctively believe, that we are personifying the mother bird. We're putting ourselves in that, in her nest, as it were, and we are acting according the way that we would hope that some predator would act to us. Okay, that's the way that it's normally thought of. But there is a Zohar which gives a different way of looking at it entirely. And the Zohar's way of looking at it is that the bird's nest is a metaphor for Am Yisrael. And God is our mother bird. And we are the fledglings. And the way of what Shiluach HaKen does is motivates God, right? Nudges God's mercy. Right? See what's happening to this mother bird, see what's happening to the fledglings. You should be thinking about your fledglings. You should be having mercy for your fledglings. And by that rationale, that granted, first of all, the idea is a beautiful idea when you think about it, in terms of this connection that we feel with God as being God's fledglings. But by that, if you take it one step further, so then we really should be nudging God as much as we can. So we should be shooing away mother's bird, so that way God is really its emotion is being spurred on by the mitzvot that we are fulfilling. It doesn't speak to me personally. Okay? It doesn't. I won't poll the people in the shir to find out whether it speaks to you. But the point, though, is that those shitot, and you can imagine the poskim who say that, oh yes, you should go try to find a mother bird and do this are going to be falling more on the Kabbalistic Hasidic side of the spectrum, and those poskim who are saying that you shouldn't be doing are going to be falling more, if you will, on the pure halachic rationalist side of the spectrum. But what they have in common here, and this is what's important from this particular shir, not that I don't think anyone is going to go out, certainly not before the bagel breakfast, and look for mother birds. But rather that but what they have in common is that they're both using the rationale that they view for the mitzvah as being the defining question for the application of the mitzvah. They disagree as to what the rationale is, but they agree that the rationale should be a factor in determining the question. Nobody that I'm familiar with simply says it's a mitzvah, go find the mother birds. Nobody says that. It's a question of, well, is this rationale, should you because of the rationale, or shouldn't you because of the rationale? But everyone is going to use the Taamei HaMitzvot when it is there to try to impact on the question of what to do. Yeah.
Isn't there a middle road? The if situation. If you should have to find it, then you do that. And then it sort of answers both sides.
Well, halachically is that if you find it and you want the eggs, because we could come across it in the field. If I find a nest and I see it, so should I shoo away the mother bird? The answer is, the way that most poskim would tell you, is if you need the eggs, if you want to you have a use for the fledglings for whatever the reason, you want to start raising pigeons. So then, this is the way to go about doing it, right? But that is under those circumstances. But that's the idea. Okay. Sure.